Welcome to this Proms at Home event. Proms at Home is free, but we'd love to raise money for our two wonderful beneficiary charities. Every penny raised will go to Toynbee Hall, where we support youth projects, and the North London Hospice. Like all charities, their fundraising events have been lost during coronavirus, whilst demand, especially on the services of Toynbee Hall, has grown. Please consider donating at the end of this event. Now let me introduce myself. I am Kate Webster, a board member of Proms at St Jude's, where I am responsible for Heritage Walks and the Friends group. This is the second of two walks which look at what we can learn from the individual 1911 census returns of the first residents of Hampstead Suburb. There is also an illustrated armchair version of the walk which you may want to look at later. This includes photographs or paintings of some of the characters. Part 1 of the walk is also still available on our website in both formats. We start today's walk at the junction of Farm Walk and Hampstead Way. The whole of Hampstead Way was renumbered soon after the 1911 census, which provided some challenges in working out which census forms corresponded to which addresses today. I am indebted to Janice Blackstaff, who grappled with these tricky problems, as well as contributing some ideas during the planning stage of this walk. Here we start to move away from the smaller cottage-style houses of the Artisans' Quarter, and the mix of residents begins to change. We see again numbers 221 and 219 Hampstead Way, both six-room cottage-style homes, but with distinctive hexagonal towers. The female householders of both were census resistors. This was examined in more detail on part 1 of the walk. Cross to the left-hand side of Hampstead Way and enter Lichfield Square. Not all women who were active in the social campaigning were members of the more militant suffragette groups who boycotted the census. For example, Emily Janes lived at 90 Hampstead Way. At the time of the census, Lichfield Square was a separate address. Emily was a campaigner for the rights of women and girls. She was the founding secretary of the National Union of Women Workers, which was founded in 1895 in response to the unsatisfactory working conditions faced by many women. This soon grew into a nationwide network of small groups, and within 2 years had become affiliated to the International Council of Women. Although many prominent women were members, they came from a wide range of points of view, and its purpose was to be a uniting umbrella organisation. It was described by Beatrice Webb as almost flagrantly non-political. Its aims were to promote sympathy of thought and purpose among the women of Great Britain and Ireland, to promote the social, civil, moral and religious welfare of women, to share information likely to be of service to women workers, and to encourage the federation of women's organisations at local as well as national level. It was not part of the women's suffrage movement. Although this was one of the many subjects members were interested in, it was by far from the most important, and members covered all shades of opinion. The organisation still exists, working in the UK and internationally on issues of concern to women. Since 1918, it has been known as the National Council of Women of Great Britain. Henrietta Barnett was an early member of the organisation and later was chair of the Suburb group. The census forms for Lichfield Square show two concentrations of residents with similar employments. This also occurred in roads in the Artisans' Quarter, although not to such a marked extent. It is likely that this was because of the availability of large numbers of new properties to rent, spread in part by word of mouth. In Lichfield Square, numbers 29 to 32, which was renumbered in 1913 to 102 to 108 Hampstead Way, were all inhabited by heads of household who were second division civil servants. Similarly, there was a grouping of 4 artist designers. The most prominent of these were Charles Henry Collins Baker, who lived at 94 Hampstead Way. He was an able watercolour painter who displayed at the Royal Academy. He was best known as an art critic and art historian. At the time of the census, he was assistant and secretary to the director of the National Gallery, and he himself was to become keeper or director of the National Gallery from 1914 to 1934. From 1928 to 1934, he was also surveyor of the King's Pictures. Equally prominent was James Bolivar Manson, who lived at 34 Lichfield Square, which is today 98 Hampstead Way. He was secretary of the Camden Town group of artists. He still has works in major UK collections such as Tate and the National Portrait Gallery. He was an art historian, writer and administrator. At this time he was working at the Tate Gallery and was important enough to be exempted from military service as indispensable during the First World War. He was influential in the acceptance of Impressionist painting in Britain. He was to become director of the Tate Gallery from 1930 to 1938, although apparently he wasn't very good in the role. In 1938 he retired to be a full-time artist. His wife too was artistic. She was a violinist and was later to become head of music at North London Collegiate School. The circumstances of Manson's retirement were notorious. On the 4th of March 1938, Manson attended a dinner at the Hotel George V in Paris to celebrate the British exhibition taking place at the Louvre Museum. Clive Bell, the art critic, recorded the events in a letter to his wife. Manson arrived at the déjeuner given by the Minister of Beaux-Arts, fantastically drunk, punctuated the ceremony with catcalls and cock-a-doodle-doos, and finally staggered to his feet, hurled obscene insults at the company in general and the minister in particular, and precipitated himself on the ambassadress, Lady Phipps, some say with amorous intent, others with lethal intent. Bell concluded, "The guests fled, ices uneaten, coffee undrunk. I hope an example will be made and that they will seize the opportunity for turning the sot out of the Tate, not because he is a sot, but because he has done nothing but harm to modern painting." Leaving Lichfield Square, at 183 on the left-hand side, we come to the home of Richard Oliver. He was a silversmith, a member of a long-established family firm of silversmiths in Clerkenwell, who specialised in gold and silver watch case making. Nearby, on the opposite side of the road, at 201, lived one of the many architects then living in Hampstead Garden Suburb. Francis James Hart, aged 30 at the time of the census, was then near the beginning of his career, but later was jointly responsible with his partner George Val Meyer for the iconic design of Broadcasting House, home of the BBC. Moving on, again on the left-hand side of the road, we passed Lucas Square. Unlike Lichfield, it didn't have similar groupings of residents. Other than 2 vacant houses, there was a mix of professionals, such as a dentist, architect, electrical engineer and an academic, a butcher and some older women of private means. This more middle-class mix was typical of Hampstead Way as a whole at this point, as the size and therefore the cost of the housing was higher. We now move on to 175 Hampstead Way, which is just beyond Lucas Square, but on the right-hand side of the road. Here we find the home of Albert Mansbridge, another social reformer. He was the founder of the WEA, or Workers' Education Association, in 1903 and a pioneer of adult education. He was the son of a carpenter and left school aged 14. He was largely self-educated. However, he managed to attend university extension courses at King's College London, although he didn't actually take a degree. He eventually taught evening classes himself in economics, industrial history and typing, all whilst continuing to work as a clerk during the day. He was concerned that extension courses were mainly aimed at the upper and middle classes, and he was passionate about education for the working class. The Association to Promote the Education of Working Men was formed at a meeting between him and his wife in their living room in January 1903, at which she contributed 2 shillings and 6pence from the housekeeping as working funds and voted Albert as the honorary secretary. The association then took off rapidly. The official founding meeting was at Toynbee Hall later on in 1903, and its inaugural conference was held at Oxford in August of the same year. The name was changed to the WEA in 1905. This was influenced especially by Mansbridge's mother, who was a member of the Women's Cooperative Guild, and others who pointed out that the initial name was sexist. He was the first General Secretary. Passionate, charismatic and very hard-working, much of the growth of the WEA was down to his drive and travel around the UK and beyond. He founded WEAs in Canada, Australia and New Zealand. We now move on to 121 Hampstead Way. This is on the opposite side of the road, that is, the right, and just past the junction with Hill Close. This was the home of another female householder who withheld cooperation with the census, but we know nothing more about her. We now arrive at the junction of Meadway and Hampstead Way. At the time of the census, much of this area was still under construction, and from this point onwards the housing was more intermittent. We'll make a short deviation to the left to number 7 Meadway, which is on the left-hand side of the road, although you might wish to cross over to get a better view of this and the adjoining properties. This house was designed by and built for Michael Bunny. The partnership of Bunny and Makins designed a large number of houses throughout Hampstead Garden Suburb, both before and after the war. Returning to Hampstead Way and turn left towards the Heath Extension. Here, development was concentrated on the right-hand side. From numbers 107 to 101, a small group of houses had been completed. At 101 lived the Reverend James Rushbrook, the first minister of the Free Church. The Reverend Rushbrook had been inducted in December 2010. Building had started on the Free Church at the beginning of 1911, and the foundation stones were laid in March, and the church itself opened in late October. So this was a temporary residence for him, pending the completion of the manse. An aside about the Free Church. Initially, Christian worship in the new suburb had taken place in a workman's hut, with joint services for Church of England and nonconformist parishioners, with the style of the Sunday service alternating between the denominations, but both groups worshipping together. When the decision was taken to have a separate Church of England and nonconformist building, Henrietta Barnett was keen that both should have equally prominent positions. There was a question as to which of the nonconformist groupings the Free Church should be offered to. Henrietta Barnett's idea was to offer it to all, although she was told, including rather forcefully by her husband, that this would not work. Not for the first time, Henrietta Barnett was proved right. This Manchester Guardian report on the opening of the Free Church reads as follows. The latest experiment to be tried in the enterprising air of the Hampstead Garden suburb is that of a free church, which is really free to all denominations. The suburb has obtained the most original church in or near London. The foundation is not less original for the fact that there is no other interdenominational free church in the country. Other houses in this group include professionals and senior civil servants. For example, at 105 lived Rear Admiral Edward Owen Hefford. He was an engineer commander working in Whitehall at the Ordnance and Naval Office. We now come to number 85, better known today as the home of Jonathan Ross. In 1911, it was the home of a young stockbroker. But John Bevan Braithwaite was later to become chairman of the Stock Exchange, a position he held from 1949 to 1959. He was also a prominent member of the HGS Preservation Society. He and his wife were both from prominent Quaker families. We now move on to the junction of Hampstead Way and Corringham Road. If time allows, we can make a deviation here and walk down to the junction of Rotherwick Road and Finchley Road. Rotherwick Road and Corringham Road, only part of which was in the suburb, was still under construction. The census lists 45 houses in Rotherwick Road, although only 15 were both completed and occupied on census night. The birthplaces of the heads of household were much more diverse than those found in the Artisans' Quarter. Only 2 out of 15 were born in London, the same proportion as were born overseas, one in the USA and the other in New Zealand. As with many suburb roads, there is evidence of the development and construction of the suburb. Albert Chapellow was employed by the Hampstead Garden Suburb Development Company and lived at number 1 Rotherwick Road, at the junction with Finchley Road, whilst Reuben Davis lived at number 10 on the left-hand side and hailed from Loughborough. He was a builder's manager for the firm William Moss and Sons of Loughborough, who built much of the pre-World War I suburb and in fact moved their headquarters to Cricklewood. Even more significant was the Drysdale family at number 49 Rotherwick Road. Their census form was returned blank. This was obviously the work of Mrs. Bessie Drysdale, and she wrote on the form, "As the government refuses me a vote, and as I am not recognised as a citizen, I refuse to perform the duties of one in giving the information required by the government." And she signs herself as a member of the Women's Freedom League. The form was subsequently completed by the enumerator. In fact, Bessie, like Edith Howe Martin, was a founder member of the Women's Freedom League, and she was on the first National Executive Committee. She was also arrested on the 14th of February 1907. Her husband, Charles Vickery Drysdale, was the son of the doctors Charles Drysdale and Alice Vickery, and he was an electrical engineer and social reformer. He founded the Men's League for Women's Suffrage and also sat on the Men's Committee for Justice for Women, so he was just as committed to women's suffrage as his wife. He himself is remembered for opening the first birth control clinic in Britain in 1921. This is marked by a blue plaque on the site in Walworth, South London. He was assisted in this by Bessie, but she is not mentioned. He also co-founded the Family Planning Association in 1930. As an engineer, he is remembered as the inventor of the phase-shifting transformer. He was also co-founder of the Institute of Physics and served as its vice president between 1932 and 1936. Both Bessie and Charles wrote for the Free Woman publication. This covered the full range of topics related to female emancipation, although the publication itself became notorious for advocating free love, opposition to marriage and tolerance of homosexuality, so much so that W.H. Smith refused to stock it. Another suburb resident, Rebecca West, who we met on the first half of the walk in Chatham Close, also wrote for it. A less controversial resident of Rotherwick Road was David Shackleton, who lived at number 55. However, the description of senior civil servant on his census form hides a fascinating backstory. He is the subject of a book entitled The Lancashire Giant. Born into poverty near Rawtenstall in Lancashire, he became a cotton worker at the age of 9. He rose through the Cotton Weavers' Union to become General Secretary of the Textile Factory Workers Association. In 1902, in a by-election for the seat of Clitheroe, Lancashire, he was elected unopposed as only the third ever Labour MP. He played a critical role in the infancy of the Labour Party and became chair of the Trade Unions Congress in 1906. In 1910, Winston Churchill invited him to join the civil service, and Shackleton left Parliament. He quickly rose to the rank of Permanent Secretary in the new Ministry of Labour, and is considered the first man from a working-class background to rise to such a senior position. During the First World War, he contributed to Lord Lloyd George's War Cabinet and was knighted in 1917. We now return to Hampstead Way, where our next stop is number 51. This was known as Heath Close Corner in the census due to its location at the junction with Hampstead Way and Corringham Way. This was the home of Dugald Sutherland McColl, who was the keeper of the Wallace collection. He was a Scottish watercolour painter, art critic, lecturer and writer. He was the keeper of the Tate Gallery for 5 years from 1906 to 1911 before moving to the Wallace collection, where he stayed from 1911 to 1924. He was instrumental in the foundation of the National Art Collections Fund, which is now known as the Art Fund. Now enter Heath Close and stop in a safe place. As we have walked the length of Hampstead Way, we have traversed the full range of housing and incomes. In Heath Close, we find some of the largest houses in the new suburb, all with 8 or 9 rooms. The mix of occupations is very much middle and middle class, including managers, a solicitor, a congregational minister, a retired architect, Charles H.M. Milam, who was also the father-in-law of Courtney Crickmer, who was active in Hampstead Garden Suburb, having formerly worked with Raymond Unwin in Letchworth. Their birthplaces were also much more diverse. Only one of the householders was born in London. 2 others were born outside the UK, one in Russia and one in the USA. A similar pattern was true of their wives. Interestingly, whilst 1 or 2 of the female servants were London-born, far more came from more rural areas outside London, which is probably a reflection of the limited opportunities for female employment in these places. The Sirazzi family, he was a wholesale produce importer and was born in Russia, whilst his wife was born in Hungary, had obviously been settled in London for some time, but they had a cook from Denmark. Maybe this was a comment on British cooking at the time. Another resident of Heath Close was a tea merchant, Gerald Brooke. He had joined the family business in 1899, initially learning that business from behind the counter in the family's Leeds shop. He'd succeeded his father, who had founded the business in 1910, as the chairman of Brookbond Tea, a role he continued in until 1952. Gerald greatly expanded the business, including developing PG Tips and the family's plantations in Kenya. We also meet James Bamford. At 44, he was already a retired mill owner from Lancashire. The increasing wealth of residents is also shown in the employment of servants. Of the 49 people living in Heath Close on census night, 13 or 27% were servants. This contrasted with a mere 2% in Asmonds Hill and only 10% on the remainder of Hampstead Way with its mix of housing. As in Asmonds Hill, servants were largely absent in the whole of the artisans' quarter. We now proceed to Waterlow Court, at the bottom of Heath Close. Henrietta Barnett was quick to recognise the need for safe and affordable provision for single working women, who were a growing group at this time. David Waterlow, chairman of the Improved Industrial Dwellings Company, was approached. Following his agreement, M.H. Bailey Scott was commissioned to design Waterlow Court. The court is named after Lord Sidney Waterlow, a philanthropist and founder of the Improved Industrial Dwellings Company, who also gave Waterlow Park to Highgate Village. There were 49 flats in Waterlow Court, mainly two-roomed, although a few were larger, with several occupants. Each had their own washing facilities. There was also a range of communal facilities, such as the dining room, library, croquet lawns and a garden. As ever, Henrietta Barnett was keen to encourage the cultivation of the vegetable patch. There were servants to clean the communal areas, to operate the dining room and to provide cleaning services for those residents who paid an additional charge. All residents were required to take a minimum number of meals in the dining room each week to make this service viable. The lady superintendent and cashier and a further 10 female servants were housed in an 8-room bungalow at the rear of the building. The male superintendent, his non-working wife and his brother-in-law, who was employed as the porter, lived in a flat at the entrance to the court. These two men were the only exceptions to what was described as an Adamless Eden. 7 flats were unoccupied on census night, which was 14% of the total. This seems surprisingly high, given that the property was fully completed and advertisements from the time suggest that there was a waiting list. It is a reasonable assumption that these might have been vacated by census evaders. Surprisingly, there were 2 children, a 4-year-old girl living with her mother and a 12-year-old who lived with her aunt. The latter pair had both been born in India, so presumably the child was either an orphan or her parents were still in India. One other minor, aged 16, lived with her mother and was a student librarian at the School of Economics. 14 or 29% of the residents were self-employed, and in a couple of instances also employed others. The self-employed were most often artists, although individuals were nurses, language teachers, and secretary stenographers. This growing area of office and administrative work was one where several were employers. Office and admin work was the most common occupation, accounting for 1/3 of the residents. Also prominent were education, which included teaching, both in private schools and for the London County Council, lecturing and other related areas. Artists, usually painters, but also a sculptor, a writer and a professional violinist, were another group. Most of these were self-employed. 10% of employed residents were nurses, whilst the 3 retired residents had also been in nursing. Only one woman was employed in retailing. Whilst this was a very significant employer of female workers at the time, it is unlikely that the wages would have been sufficient to afford the combined costs of rent, meals and travel required to live at Waterlow Court. It is clear that although intended as affordable housing for what Henrietta Barnett described as working ladies, it would have been beyond the means of many. It is not possible to find out very much about any of the residents beyond what is given in the census. One exception is Mabel Stringer, who, born in 1868, she lived until 1958. She was the first female sports journalist in the country, specialising in golf and working at this more or less full-time from 1903. She is a very important figure in the early history of women's golf. Recent research on domestic service and the role of women before the First World War can be found in a publication called The Green Baize Door. And this writes of Waterlow the following: Egalitarianism was not the aim at Waterlow. The servants' hall was smaller than the residents' common room, and their bedrooms were shared, sometimes between 3 or 4, with a single bath and toilet between them all. They weren't invited to their employers' clubs, but were offered wholesome recreations instead. Servants were difficult to recruit at Waterlow Court due to the distance from the attractions of central London, and that may well have been the case in the suburb generally. We now leave Heath Close and move on to the next close, Reynolds Close. This was pretty much the extent of the developed area of Hampstead Garden Suburb at the time, with only a handful of houses to be found beyond here. In Reynolds Close there were 25 houses, but 4 had yet to be occupied, whilst 2 were occupied only by servants, who were possibly preparing for full occupation. These were also large houses, similar in size to Heath Close. Well, who lived there? The 21 occupied houses contained 107 people on census night. There were 36 males and 71 females. There was a marked gender imbalance, with females dominating in a ratio of 2-1. This was very similar to Heath Close, where the proportion of women was 63%, and in both cases was due to the presence of female servants living in. 1/3 of the residents were servants. 95% of the occupied houses in Reynolds Close had at least one servant. The average number was 1.76. Most houses had 2, and 2 houses had 3 servants. Many homes had a cook and a more general servant, whilst those with young children frequently had a nurse. One home had a male servant employed as a butler. Only 1/5 of residents worked outside the home. Heads of household were largely professional or managerial. For example, a physician-surgeon, a shipbroker, managing director, and the director of the Census of Production. 2 were self-employed as artist-painters. 2 surprising exceptions were the commercial traveller and a salesman in meat. 1 female head of household was in employment as a Swedish remedial gymnast and midwife, but the other female heads were widows of private means. A few single women worked outside their homes, for example in teaching, and 1 was a lady gardener. Perhaps the best known name in Reynolds Close was Plimsoll. The widow of Samuel Plimsoll, inventor of the Plimsoll line, which made British shipping so much safer in the middle of the 19th century, lived here with her family. We now have an optional extension to the walk, which will be mainly walking and end eventually at Wild's farmhouse at the edge of the sandy heath. If you're going to do this, we now walk on to Wellgarth Road, stopping at the junction. Building here, as in the rest of Hampstead Way, had barely started and proceeded mainly as single houses. However, there were 2 houses at this time in Wellgarth Road, one of whose inhabitants, Dr. Washington Epps, is noteworthy. He came from a family who had been prominent in the development of homeopathy and owned a chain of homeopathic chemists. He himself was a doctor at the London Hospital for Homeopathy and was one of several doctors important in the acceptance of homeopathy within conventional medicine. This is now the Royal London Hospital for Integrated Medicine and is part of UCH. His family was well connected to social reformers and artists. Washington Epps' sister was married to the artist Alma Tadema. This resulted in Epps being painted by him. The portrait Dr. Washington Epps, My Doctor, by Alma Tadema was given to Epps in 1912 and stayed in the family until 2002. It is now in the Carnegie Museum of Art, Pittsburgh, USA, and has recently appeared in social media in tribute to the health services during the COVID-19 outbreak in the USA. Beyond Wellgarth Road, there was an outline plan for the remainder of Hampstead Way and Moorland and Romney Closes, but the latter each only had one inhabited house by the time of the census. We walk on to Wild's Close. This lies off Hampstead Way, beyond the junction with Wildwood Road, on the left-hand side. Walk into the close. Again here there was only one house. The householder was Charles Evelyn Simmons, who designed it for himself. He was born and educated in Hampstead, and it is likely that he worked as an architect on the building of Hampstead Garden Suburb, since he had qualified in 1905 but did not start to practice independently until 1912 when he applied for licentiate status of Reba. This is given further weight by his work in Gretna during World War I. Raymond Unwin, the master architect of Hampstead Garden Suburb, was responsible for planning and designing the new settlement of Gretna to provide housing for munitions workers at the new munitions factory built during World War I. Simmons was co-designer of St Ninian's Roman Catholic Church in Gretna, along with Courtney Crickmer. Courtney Crickmer was the resident architect for Gretna, but had also been a major contributor to the Hampstead Garden Suburb, as were a number of the other architects working there. Today, Simmons is best known for Deco-style buildings, notably Chiswick Village in West London and the White House in Downage in Hendon. We now move on to Wild's Farm, so retrace your steps to Hampstead Way, and at the junction of Hampstead, or just after the junction of Hampstead Way with Wildwood Road, you'll find a track which goes up on the right-hand side onto the heath. Follow this round to the right and proceed along it until you come to Wild's Farm. At the moment, this is not easy to see due to the high hedges and building works. But in 1911, Wild's Farm was the home of Raymond Unwin. According to the census, he lived here with his wife, 2 children, resident secretary and 2 servants. It was a very large building with 12 rooms. It was also where the suburb drawing office was located. Wild's Farm was part of the parcel of land purchased for the building of Hampstead Garden Suburb from Eton College. The farmhouse is an historic building with a rich history and literary associations, but it has been much altered over the years. The barn was converted by Raymond Unwin to become the drawing office, and Unwin continued to live here until his death in the 1940s. Since then, the buildings have been divided into 2 homes. So, in summary of the walk, Henrietta Barnett wanted Hampstead Garden Suburb to accommodate all classes. This has always been considered somewhat fanciful due to the relatively high cost of housing here, and the received wisdom has been that even the so-called artisans' quarter, this was never true. Actually, the evidence of the 1911 census is that whilst the suburb would have been inaccessible to the very poor, both due to its cost and location, at least for a short period during construction and prior to the First World War, the social and economic mix of the suburb was at its greatest. There were undoubtedly streets which were predominantly inhabited by artisans and their families. Overall, the mix of housing meant that there were fewer servants in Hampstead Garden Suburb than nationally, but the most affluent homes had a higher proportion of servants than was the national picture. The age of the population was younger than average, but this is typical of new residential areas which tend to attract a high proportion of new families. The exception to this, of course, was the Orchard, which, like Waterlow Court, reflected Henrietta Barnett's well-developed knowledge of housing needs. However, the overall small number of older people shouldn't be a surprise. Life expectancy was only 54 for women and 50 for men at this time. On this basis, the older people in the new suburb had almost certainly bucked the trend on the basis of their relative class and affluence, which gave them good health. That the population of the suburb was also healthier is evidenced in another aspect of the census forms. People were asked how many children had been born to each couple and how many were still alive. Family sizes here were smaller than average, and there were very few families of any income group who had lost children, even though infectious disease was still a problem, irrespective of class. This also suggests that generally people were not coming to the suburb from the most deprived areas where children would have been lost to diseases such as consumption or tuberculosis. The proportion of females in the suburb was much greater than nationally. The proportion of women living in the population as a whole was greater in London and even higher in Middlesex than was the case in the rest of the country. This was probably because of the growing concentration of female employment opportunities in London in emerging fields such as clerical and administration, telephony, typing, the growth of education, nursing and the civil service. London also drew women to work in domestic service from areas where there were few female employment opportunities. However, figures in the suburb were also skewed by the presence of the Orchard and Waterlow Court, as well as by servants and suffragette open houses. The evidence of birthplace shows that the population was very mobile even within London. In the artisans' quarter, it is apparent from birthplace information that families had moved around and children were often born in different parts of London. This probably reflected the shortage of housing in a growing city and the need to be near work. Many people moved to London for work, and the more educated and higher status occupations tended to result in longer migrations. The more middle-class areas of the suburb were peopled by residents who had been born throughout the British Isles and to a lesser extent throughout the world. It is also noticeable that there were a number of socially aware and reform-minded residents in the early years. This is not surprising given the idealistic aspirations and Fabian connections of the Garden City movement and Henrietta Barnett's aim that to create a garden suburb not for one class only, but to include people of what she described as all degrees, in which the houses of the industrial classes will be beautiful. That is the end of the walk, so I thank you very much for attending this Proms at Home event. You may wish to recap aspects of the walk and look at the illustrations by going to the armchair walk, which is on the Proms at St Jude's website. You can find other events in this special Proms at Home season, including concerts, Litfest talks, family events, and the first part of this guided walk on our website. I hope that we will get to meet you in person at next year's Proms Festival in June 2021. Please don't forget we are raising money for Toynbee Hall and the North London Hospice. And if you'd like to donate, please go to our website and click on our virtual donation bucket. Thank you very much and goodbye.